Welcome to Poets and Poetry, and thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions regarding the program, poets, books, or societies mentioned, please contact the phone number or email address listed before and after the program. I am Leona Welch, President Emeritus of the Texoma Poetry Society, a chartered chapter of the Poetry Society of Texas. The motto of our chapter is Promoting Poetry by Participation. The purpose of this program is to promote and encourage the writing of poetry and to kindle a finer appreciation of this creative language art, with introductions to poets reading their selected award-winning poetry. Poets write to express emotions, to convey a thought, describe the beauty of nature, to leave a written part of ourselves. No two write for the same reason. As a firm believer in the healing power of poetry, I like the statement made by Robert Frost, and I quote, "A poem begins as a lump in the throat, a sense of wrong, a homesickness, a lovesickness. It finds the thought, and the thought finds the words." There are few better in the world of poetry at finding the right words for any situation than our guest today. Known throughout the literary art world as the poet from Double Oak, it is my pleasure to introduce J. Paul Holcomb. Thank you for coming, Paul.
You're mighty welcome, Leona.
And thank you so much for bringing your poetry to us today. Paul will be later reading in the Texoma Poetry Society meeting, and though I've heard him read his poetry on many occasions, it is always inspiring to hear. So, let's start at your beginning.
Okay.
Tell us about where you grew up.
Well, I'm a native Texan. I was born in Littlefield, Texas. My folks were living in the little town of Earth at the time, so I like to say men may be from Mars and women from Venus, but I come from Earth.
Okay.
My dad was a Methodist minister, and my early years were in the South Plains and the Panhandle, and then we came on down more toward the big country, and I graduated from high school in Sweetwater. And,
okay. I believe you attended college in Abilene?
In Abilene at McMurray College. It's now McMurray University. So.
Okay. Well, tell us about your studies there.
Well, I was a math major. I wanted to be, when I went to school, I wanted to be a statistician, but they didn't have a major in statistics, so I majored in math. There was a business statistics course, so my junior year, when I discovered I needed a minor, I tried to minor in business, but there wasn't enough time to get it in and finish in 4 years, which was my goal. So I did take my business statistics course, but I decided to minor in English, and because I already had 12 hours, and so I got my minor in English, and the last semester I took creative writing, and that's when I discovered the joys of poetry.
Oh, I see. And I think that's an interesting aspect from each poet that have visited with us, is to why and where and when they started writing poetry. I understand you were an officer in the U.S. Air Force.
Yes, after I graduated from McMurray, by the time I graduated, I had decided I wanted to go to graduate school in English, but I decided to take time in the Air Force and kind of get myself stabilized, and so I went to officer training school,
Uh-huh.
and came out as a second lieutenant and spent several years in the Air Force.
No, that's interesting. I knew you had been there, but I didn't know you had spent that much time there. What were your duties in there, and how did this influence your career later?
Well, when I started in the Air Force, I was what was called a weapons director. I was an aircraft controller and controlled manned interceptors and would take them to their targets. We were worried about, at that time, in air defense, we were worried about the manned bomber. And so we would, so I was an intercept director, or really an air traffic controller. But various things occurred, and I got into, mainly I got married and had goals of trying to stay stateside, and I got into software engineering in the Air Force, and spent the first 2 years in aircraft control, and then the last 4 in software.
I see. When did you move to Double Oak?
Well, when I got out of the Air Force in February '69, we wanted to come back to Texas, and we had married. My wife had hardly been out of Texas before we married, and I took her to Syracuse, New York.
Oh, my word.
And then we spent 4 good years in Colorado Springs, Colorado. So we wanted to come back to Texas, and we did. And I took a job with Collins Radio in Richardson, and so we lived the first few years in Garland, and then from '72 to '74, I went to work for Recognition Equipment in Irving, and during that time we moved over to Louisville. Well, in '74, I went back to Collins, which was now part of Rockwell, but we liked Louisville, so we stayed there. And then in 1985, we moved out. Instead of moving east, closer to work, we moved west to Double Oak. We like to say that we never saw a tree till we were in college. And so we're on a tree, like there are probably 300 trees in our yard.
Oh, my word, okay. I do want to mention that Paul's lovely wife, Sue Ann, is an internationally known teddy bear artist, and they travel throughout the U.S. To shows there. And I was hoping Sue Ann would join Paul today, and I'm disappointed that she couldn't. How long have you and Sue Ann been married?
We've been married 41 years, so we're in our 42nd year now.
And you have 2 lovely daughters.
Yes, we do. One is an environmentalist. She's doing. She works at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, doing forest ecology. And then the younger daughter is an ordained minister, but she's on leave of absence right now, and she's doing music she and her husband, also a minister, live in Irving. He's at Northgate United Methodist Church, and she's doing music all over the Metroplex.
Oh, how wonderful. Do either of your daughters write poetry?
The older one does some. In fact, I took some of her poetry and got her to enter some. Well, I entered for her, did the mechanics, and got her into some of the contests in Poetry Society of Texas a few years ago. It's about a half a dozen poems, and I think 3 of them finished in the top 10. So
fantastic!
Yeah.
That's awesome.
I'm sorry.
That's a pretty tough competition.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I know you are now retired. How long did you work in your day job?
Well, I finished college in '62. Was in the Air Force until February '69, and then I was at Collins recognition equipment in Rockwell Collins from '69 to 2000. So I guess all told, it was about 38 years, and most of it was in software engineering.
Not long after he retired, I heard Paul comment that he worked harder in poetry and for the Poetry Society of Texas than he ever did in his day job. I first met Paul in 1995, and we are members of some of these same societies in addition to the Poetry Society of Texas, the National Federation of State Poetry Societies, of which you have served both as an officer, and the Galaxy of Verse Literary Foundation. Are there any other poetry organizations that you're a member of?
Oh,
a lot.
A lot.
A long list.
A long list. I'm currently the president of the Fort Worth Poetry Society. Usually a person will be a president of a local society and then go up to the state. I did it just the opposite way.
Okay.
I was president of the state before I was president of a local society. We've got a new chapter in Denton, the Denton Poets Assembly, and I'm helping them, and I'm a member of that. And I'm a member of the Poets of Tarrant County, and for a while I was a member of the Fort Worth Haiku Society.
I see.
And then I'm involved in all sorts of others. I just came back from a Writers Festival at the University of Mary Hardin Baylor in Belton.
I understand that is very, I had the honor of attending that on one occasion. It's quite an elaborate affair and a lot of fun.
Yeah, yes, and they have almost I don't know, maybe you'd say UMHB groupies. We come back every year.
You mentioned that you took creative writing in your college years. Were you interested in poetry as a child?
My dad used to quote, he would quote Robert W. Service. He would do The Shooting of Dan McGrew, and I loved to hear him do that. And I was always, I guess I made enough of a nuisance of myself that when I was about 10 or 11, for my birthday, I got the collected works of Robert W. Service and all his wonderful ballads, and
what a gift to receive.
Yeah, I didn't really do much other. I guess the first published poem I had was in high school, and I wrote it for my journalism class as an editorial. I was very embarrassed by it. Managed to hand it in at the end of the class, so I could avoid the possibility of being read aloud. And but the next week, or the next day, I guess the teacher said he loved it, and they put it in the school paper the next week.
I guess that pretty much answers my next question about how long you have been writing poetry.
Well, that was the first thing, and then I didn't really write again, and well, I did some scribbling, but I really didn't look at it seriously until I took that creative writing class in 1962.
It's funny that you mentioned the poem that you were embarrassed by. I think we have all written things that we can go back and look at now and wished we hadn't. What prompted you to write poetry? Was it a concentrated effort, or did it just come to you?
Well, it's interesting. There's a C.S. Lewis wrote a book about his, and there's a movie that includes part of it, but his, at the title of the book is Surprised by Joy. And in a way, I have always felt like that's kind of what happened to me. I was surprised by poetry. And I really intended to, was interested in short stories and fiction writing when I took the course. And I have a side part of my brain that's kind of the engineering side was just intrigued by the forms, and then I love the idea of being able of self-expression.
I see. Is there a particular poet that has been an inspiration to you other than the one you told us about your father?
Oh, I would have to say of the dead poets, probably Robert Frost was I thought was a primary influence. I was told by another poet that he could hear more of Wordsworth coming through than he could Frost, and of course Frost loved Wordsworth, so that that secondary influence was there. I loved Gerard Manley Hopkins of the 19th century because of his innovation and his sprung rhythm and that sort of thing. And I loved E.E. Cummings. I love E.E. Cummings. More recently, I would have to say that another one who's no longer living, but a recent poet that I enjoyed and consider an inspiration was John Chardy. In recent years, probably, I've just been absolutely delighted with Billy Collins and have told the story of his Paradell all over every opportunity I've had, and there are many. More from a local standpoint, I would say the poets that really influenced me most were a series of poets at the University of North Texas. I went up and took a mini course with Gene Shuford, and he actually introduced me to that and recruited me for the Poetry Society of Texas. And I took every mini course they had. Charlotte Wright, Lisa Russ, and of course Scott Cairns, he's probably the best known nationally of the bunch. But I feel I owe a huge debt to the University of North Texas.
Oh, that's wonderful. Do you write every day?
I try to. And of course, every year, this being New Year's, a new resolution is to write every day. But I tend to be more of an inspiration type writer. So I'll get ideas, and I've got notepads all over the house, where I write them down.
I want to mention that Paul's poetry has been published in state, national, and international journals, anthologies, and literary magazines. But let's talk about your books.
Okay.
Tell us about your first prize-winning book, Love or Something Like It. Did you write specifically for the competition or inner poems you had already written?
For the most part, those poems in that book are poems that had been previously published. It's in competitions, it's one thing that's always emphasized is thematic coherence. And as I was looking at a lot of the poems, I discovered that if I selected carefully, that I could come up with examples of the ways that we are affected by love throughout our lives. Parental love, grandparents, the love of our grandparents, then the other way, and then of course friends, and then our own romantic involvements. I even have love of pets, pets in that book, and and the last two poems in the book are fictional love.
I see. That might be interesting. I know you co-wrote a children's book with Sue Ann. Tell
Yes.
us how that came about.
Well, Sue Ann is very artistic, and she had this idea, and she retired. She was a medical technologist, and she retired from doing that work in the early 90s as we were getting our girls out of college. And she wanted to do something with her art, and she had this idea, and so she was working on this project for this book that we co-wrote. She wasn't happy with what she was getting in the text, so she asked me if I would write the text.
Oh, I see.
I did, and we she did many of the drawings in the early, I guess the early 90s. We went to a poetry conference in Marshall, and hosted by the Rusk County poets. And I would go to the poetry meetings, and she would stay and draw. And I would say she turned out 3 or 4 of the illustrations while I was in that conference.
Now, this is not a book of poetry, is that correct?
No, it's not. It's the story. It's a children's story, and we planned a series to promote environmental awareness to children. And so this is the story. We were going to use this little creature to promote that. And so this first book is the story of how he came about. He's half dinosaur and half armadillo.
There's a Texas legend for you.
Yeah. But we got diverted from that. We have 2 or 3 follow-ups that we planned to do, but then she got into teddy bears, and there's no way I can illustrate.
I can't draw a straight line with a ruler. In 2004, your manuscript, Looking for Love in the Telecom Corridor, was awarded the prestigious Edwin M. Eakin Book Publication Award. First, I want to know how you came by the title, and did you write specifically for the manuscript?
Okay. Most of those poems were also previously published. The title poem had not been previously published. It came. I worked, as I said, for years at Rockwell Collins, or Collins Radio, and I always thought I had kept my work life fairly separate from my poetry. But I discovered that I had several poems that were inspired from my work. And as I was putting that manuscript together, I had several poems of growing up that I wanted to include. And so slowly what happened is I developed the story of Hal. You know, many of the poems, of course, are my story, but many are not. And so, and I had a poem with Hal in the title, and so I had to modify several poems I put in the book specifically for the book, so I could get Hal into the
Got to include Hal. That's funny. I understand you write for poetry magazines. What kind of articles do you write?
I write several years ago, I was giving a speech on French forms. And afterwards, a fellow came up from the audience and said he was starting a poetry magazine in Fort Worth. And that his target audience was slam poets and performance poets. But he felt like